So without further ado from me, Richard, I'll hand over to you and look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, David, and a welcome to everyone at the Aviation Historical Society. I know a few of you, Dave Fredericks, or Fredo. I've done a little bit of work with him with the Air Force, and that's been a very, I think, good experience. And then you have Noel Jackling in the audience in Melbourne, and Noel's been a very good friend for many years because, and you probably know this, Noel is spearheading up the major research part of the flight of the Iver, and back in 1933, a wonderful flight that took place into Albury, very famous flight that really certainly put Albury and Australia on the map in the Netherlands. So that is just one of Australia's greatest stories in aviation, and Noel is doing so much work to help preserve the stories of that. And I'm grateful. I'm sure everyone here is grateful for the work Noel does. We hope it continues. And the aircraft is being restored by another group up there in Albury. And that will eventually be put on a display that will be persistent. The aircraft will be protected, and a great Australian story in aviation. I mean, this was the first flight that took paying passengers into Australia. And it happened to be conducted. These first paying passengers were on a DC-2 that had only been flying for 3 months anywhere in the world. And KLM, that took delivery of one of them, put it on a race to Australia. So imagine taking part in a worldwide race, a critical race, and putting paying passengers onto it in a race and then coming second. It is a very emotional and a wonderful story. And I'm glad that Noel is chasing this up. And it's just one of the many great stories in aviation that need to be protected and preserved and told, because, and this is really true, that aviation is an industry that just sits and derived on threats and risk. And many people have perished to try and further aviation. And they weren't necessarily trying to take high risks at times, but things went wrong. And people have paved the way, and the world has changed because of aviation. Aviation, I think, has changed the world much like the Industrial Revolution or the internet. We're all standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before us. And it seems hard to believe that Neil Armstrong was on the moon about when was it? 67, 69. So about 53 years ago. And now I just heard that United Airlines has placed an order for about 20 supersonic aircraft from Boom, which I think may never be delivered, but also it's an extraordinary industry that in the last 100 years has paved the way to enable and to change the world in a way that we probably never expected. And any part of the world is now part of our backyard. So I really take my hat off to everyone in the Historical Society for the work you do to preserve the history and to make people appreciate what aviation has given to humanity. So my part, I talked about standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'm a good example of that. I don't know if you've read my first book. It was called QF32, and that's interesting. I've got to put it here. Anyway, QF32 is really about the what. It starts with a biography of my life. I didn't really want it, but the ghostwriter who wrote the book said, if we write your biography, then everything that happened in the flight will make sense. You'll understand why I did things if you understand my background. And I now understand that is correct. So my background was, I was born in Melbourne, lived in Paran, and at the age of 17, I was a very average student. And I had to work very hard to get to the Air Force. And I managed to get into the Air Force Academy, which was I had a visit to the Air Force Academy when I was in fourth form at school, and I saw the aerodynamics labs and the maths rooms and the physics labs and the astronomy telescopes. And these were all things that just blew my mind. And I thought, I have to be part of this high tech. So I joined the Air Force in 1975. I did a science degree and a postgraduate engineering diploma. And then I learned to fly in 1980. I went to the now operational flying. I flew Caribous. And it's my observation that the slower the aircraft went in the Air Force, the more fun they were. I've flown high-speed, low-speed aircraft, and the Caribous and the Iroquois are by far the most fun. And the reason might sound, it might surprise you, but the faster the aircraft goes, the more high-tech it is, the more it needs support. And in fact, the fighters really need an umbilical cord to the bases that they fly from. So the transport aircraft, and particularly the Caribous and the Iroquois back in the 80s, they weren't high requirements in the Air Force. So people, the Air Force let you get a command in those aircraft very quickly. You're told to go away, work with the SAS for a month and then come back. And providing you didn't crash the aircraft, then the Air Force really didn't care what you did. You just had to do your job. So we were left alone. It was really exciting. We did some extraordinary flying, and all self-supervised at a very young age, you know, in the very early 20s. So it was a remarkable time flying Caribous and Iroquois. I did have a stint for a year and a half being the aide to the Governor General. By the time I'd finished Caribous in 1982, I'd been in the Air Force 7 years, and I just wanted to experience something else higher. So I think I was the only person in the Air Force that had ever applied to be an aide to the Governor General in Canberra. And so I got that job, and that was very enlightening to see how the rest of the public service worked. And there was a good side and a bad side. I thought the Foreign Affairs could be an interesting place to go to. But overwhelmingly, I left Government House in Canberra with the thought that I had seen the ministers that had commanded the different portfolios. And I thought, if I stay in the Air Force and if I get to the top, then I'll have to answer to these ministers. And they're giving me the decision that I had to get out of the Air Force. And so I did, and to pursue other things. So I joined Qantas. So I joined Qantas in 1986. Actually, that's going back. So I flew Caribous, Iroquois, Mackies. I had a, near where Fredo is now, I had it was only a 20-minute posting to F-111s. I was kicked off the F-111 course that I did 20 minutes into the welcome brief because they ran out of instructors because they had all gone to Qantas. So I had set up for many years to go to fly F-111s, which is what I really wanted to do. And my posting lasted 20 minutes. So I left the Air Force and then went to Qantas. My Qantas career was, again, I've always wanted the biggest and the fastest aircraft. So I was never really interested in the 767, and Qantas was too small. Qantas, when I joined it, only flew 747s. It was the only airline in the world that only flew 747s. Very experienced airline, very capable pilots, and I loved being on the jumbo. I joined at the right time, so within 18 months I had progressed from being a second officer on the jumbo to a first officer. And because I didn't want to go down to a smaller aircraft, I persisted on the jumbo for a long time as a first officer. And then 2004, I got my command, and I got the command on the 330 Airbus. And that was a phenomenal change. All the aircraft I've flown in, there wasn't one aircraft I'd flown in the Air Force that had an autopilot or auto thrust. I joined Qantas, and the jumbo was a bit of a steam-driven aircraft, but at least it did have an autopilot. But then when I went to the Airbus, let me try and explain. The jumbos, and even more so all the 737s, they might have some computers, but they're discrete units, and you'll have two of them, and 2 or 3 of them, and if they fail, then they're broken for the rest of the flight. On the jumbos, you would have an engineer that would try and fix them, but they're all independent computers, and if any one computer failed, it didn't really matter. When you get to the 400 jumbo, where we got rid of the flight engineer, we had to add an extra computer so that you would make sure you'd have 3 of everything, so that if you had a problem pre-flight, you could go from 3, you could accept it going from 3 computers down to 2, and you could still take off. And then you're allowed to lose 1 more computer in flight and complete the mission. So the 747-400 jumbo brought in the idea of some connected computers that and you would have 3 of them, loosely connected, and they did feed to each other, but it was still a very simple system. And then we go to Airbus, and now we go into a total paradigm shift. And the Airbus is, let me put it this way. I did ask the Boeing test pilots when I visited Boeing a couple of years ago. I said, if you were building your first aircraft in the 1980s and you had unlimited access to computers, would you build fly-by-wire, and would you build an aircraft like an Airbus? And the test pilots said yes. So in the 1980s, when Airbus started with the A300, A310, and then they were really experimental aircraft. Airbus wanted to make the first aircraft, the A300, a fly-by-wire aircraft, but the test pilots were too worried that that was too much of a revolutionary change. Let me go back a little bit. Here's the challenge, and you don't have to try and answer. But when was the first digital and the first analog fly-by-wire aircraft? Just think about that. Well, the first digital fly-by-wire aircraft, spacecraft, was the command module, the lunar module on Apollo 11 that went to the moon. And that had to be fly-by-wire because of just the relationship between the command instrument, the command inputs, and the different thrusters all across the machine. So that's 1967, the fly-by-wire was digital in NASA. And the first analog fly-by-wire was the Concorde. And the Concorde had to be fly-by-wire because when it gets hot in flight and it heats up because your stagnation temperatures are very high when the air comes to a standstill at the front of the aircraft. So the skin temperature becomes, and the turbine inlet temperatures become limiting factors. So but because the aircraft gets so hot, it stretches, and the control linkages that you might understand that work in a normal aircraft to move the ailerons and flaps, or ailerons and elevators and trims, they can't work when the aircraft stretches 2 feet. The only exception is the SR-71. I had no idea how they got the SR-71 to fly with cables and bell cranks without fly-by-wire, but that would be another story. But anyway, Concorde was fly-by-wire, had electric brakes, and in fact, a lot of the Concorde hydraulic systems still remain on Airbus designs today. So the basis for the fly-by-wire that Airbus took on with the A320 in the middle 1980s goes back a long way, and it was experience. But just think about this. Back in the year 2000, just 20 years ago, there was a lot of apprehension about fly-by-wire, and people were afraid of it. And the comment was, well, if it's not Boeing, I'm not going. And there was this fear of computers. There was this belief that the pilots don't have any control. And so people didn't trust the fly-by-wire. There were a few when I went to the A330, I did research into fly-by-wire and did research into all the crashes. And I have to backtrack. When I joined Qantas in 1986, I thought I might lose my aircrew medical. I might fail the simulators. I might lose my career as a pilot. So part of any risk and threat and error management and risk management is that you always have a backup. You always, in case something goes wrong, you have to have, in this case, another career. So I started a computer business. And so the computer business still runs. And so we were selling compilers and databases and all kinds of special stuff. So I understood computers and I researched Airbus, and I thought, you know, the Airbus systems are very logical. You have to understand that if you understand the logic, then they become very predictable. But it takes a lot of effort. You have to do the work up front. And this thought that you have no control in an Airbus would be real. The perception is real for those people who don't understand computer logic or how computers work. So we need to really change. The pilots who will go to fly-by-wire would have to change their mindset. And so to move from the Boeing 747 to the Airbus 330 was a phenomenal change. And I loved it because I'm a logical person and I understand computer logic. So the 330 was great. And in 2008, just background again, the interesting thing was that with all these changes in aircraft, particularly the change from non-fly-by-wire to fly-by-wire, probably 60% of the pilot group were very worried about converting to fly-by-wire. And they all wanted, when these new aircraft came out, the pilots would say, I'll wait to see how it goes before I move there. So in the case of the 330 and the A380, both high-tech fly-by-wire, I managed to jump hundreds of numbers in seniority. You see, I shouldn't have normally been, I wasn't senior enough to get on those aircraft, except the pilots didn't request to go to those aircraft because they sort of feared them. They feared this fly-by-wire logic. But because I was happy to get into it and I knew that I'd make mistakes, but everyone does in aviation, you just learn as you go. I was confident that I could conquer it, given the time. So I applied for and I jumped hundreds of numbers in seniority to bid for these two fly-by-wire aircraft, which was the 330 and the 380. The 380 is like a 330 that on steroids. So we had four engines. There are six primary flight control computers. Three primary flight control computers, three secondary, and there's another emergency backup computer. So there's 7 flight control computers, and any one of them could control the aircraft. So that is a mammoth task for Airbus to accomplish. I mean, just imagine to keep 7 computers online and fed with the same information so that if one computer fails, the other one can take over in a split, in a 20th of a second with all the same data in track. The requirements to pass data between these computers is intense. And so these aircraft were really, the A380 is a phenomenal aircraft. And because it is so big, its maximum takeoff weight's about 580 tons. An extraordinary aircraft. Interestingly, I was also writing a technical book on big jets. So if there are pilots here, they might know a book called Handling the Big Jets by D.P. Davies. Davies was actually an Australian, but he wrote this book back in the 1970s. It's become the Bible for pilots wanting to go to bigger jets. And I wanted to rewrite that and bring it into the digital age. So I met with Airbus. I'd spoken to all the test pilots and the aerodynamicists, and went to Boeing and spoke to them. And I was actually at Rolls-Royce in their offices in Derby 2 weeks before the QF32 event, doing research on the engines for the book. So I had a fascination on getting all this stuff together. And so it meant that I had a really good grounding in how the aircraft was designed, how the fly-by-wire worked. I remember being quite critical to Airbus, saying the 380 is too big. I doubt that it's going to work. In other words, and this might, if I've been boring you today, this might be more interesting. If you think about all the flying things in the world, from the tiniest mosquito up to an albatross, then to a big aircraft in the 380, they all follow the same aerodynamics. And what it means is that as you go faster, Well, let me be simpler. If you take a length and you double it, that's 2 times the length. But then if you do an area, it's 2 times 2, it's 4 times the area. If you double the length of an aircraft, you go 2 times 2 times 2, it's 8 times the size. So you get into this cubed rule. And the cube law means that just to make an aircraft bigger, doubling the length increases the weight or the size by 8 times. So the jumbo, the 747-400, was just about at the maximum weight that you can fly in the atmosphere. You see, if the weight increases with the cube, but the area or the wing area increases with the square of a dimension, what that means is your wing loading has to increase with the dimension. To increase the wing loading, you've got to go faster. That's why mosquitoes fly slowly. That's why the heavier you get, the faster you have to go. That's why storm petrels are called storm petrels, because the storm petrel was so small, it couldn't beat the headwinds back. If there was an ocean, if there was a sea wind that was faster than its cruising speed, and the petrel was out of the ocean, it wouldn't get home and it would drown. So the storm petrel had to predict the weather. And if it predicted the weather was such that it couldn't beat its cruising speed home and get into the wind, it would stay on the rocks. So the storm petrel actually became a weather forecaster for the rest of humanity. But then you get to the biggest birds, the maritime birds, the albatrosses. They're very big, they're very heavy. They now have a cruising speed that can beat the winds, the sea winds anywhere on the earth, and so they can navigate the earth. And so you take this speed and you keep increasing, you get into the Goss, and then you get into the 737, Jumbo, A380. Because the speed has to increase, you get up to a speed where the speed of sound becomes a problem. So the Jumbo was up near the maximum, and the 380 just blew that out of the water. So the 380 is actually too big for this atmosphere, the gases in this atmosphere and the speed of sound. So I took these kinds of questions to Airbus, and they had trouble answering it. They gave me some answers. So the 380 is very much overwinged, too much wing, which means it can slow down and fly in the atmosphere. But what it means is a lot of drag. So the 380 is a truly remarkable aircraft, but it is too heavy for this atmosphere. And if you really want to make an efficient aircraft, you'd make a smaller one. It'd be between the 747-400 and the 380. Might be a maximum weight of 480, 500 tons, but not heavier. So the 350 and the 777s are really moving towards the optimum size aircraft for the atmosphere. Anyway, I'm sorry I'm diverting too much, but coming into the 380 arrived in Australia in 2008. That's when Qantas got them. It's $4 million past $400 million. Take-off weight about 580 tons. Carries about 250 tons of fuel. Everything is big. It's the first aircraft that was designed to be quiet. In other words, Boeing put extra weight. Weight is everything in an aircraft. Airbus put aluminium wire, so the aluminium core with a cover over it to stop corroding. They put the main looms are made of aluminium to save 300 kilograms in weight. And they spent millions of dollars doing this. So they were trying to cut the weight down on the 380, but they did put on extra weight to put soundproofing in the aircraft. So there are 4 reasons why the 380 is so quiet. Number 1, soundproofing, which other aircraft don't have. Number 2, the engines are very quiet, so that produces less noise. Number 3, they control the aerodynamics of the fuselage to stop supersonic flow. If you have supersonic flow at the top, it has to slow down somewhere, and so you get shock waves and noise from the friction. So the Jumbo has supersonic flow over the fuselage. The 380 has no supersonic flow over the fuselage. So that's a 3rd reason. And the 4th reason is, and sorry to get technical again, but the noise that you get from air flowing through a pipe is proportional to the velocity to the power of 8. I don't know anything else in science that increases with the power of 8. That if you double the speed of air in a pipe, it will be 256 times noisier. So the Jumbo had these ducts, a few ducts really quite big, carrying the air conditioning air through the aircraft. And the air was going very fast through these ducts, and it was very noisy. If you remember the jumbos, a lot of the noise you heard was actually air conditioning noise. So in the 380, between every window, there's a duct that's about 4 inches round, and there's a duct for every row of seats. It's slow flowing, and that means that air conditioning sound is less. So these are the reasons why the 380 is pretty well the quietest aircraft in the sky. Now, I haven't flown on the 787. People say that's pretty quiet. I believe the 350 is noisier than a 380, so they probably didn't want to put too much soundproofing in it. But if you think about the 380, it's heavy, it's quiet, it's powerful, it flies high, and it's also got the derivation of years of fly-by-wire, where when the aircraft, if you really want to think of an aircraft as a fuselage with rubber bands as wings, and the wings are going to do this, the engines on the wings are going to nod, and the fuselage is going to buckle and twist. And so whenever if you think of the guitar, the strings on a guitar, you know, maybe a 12-string guitar, each string has a different sound. And as you move your fingers along the string, it changes the frequency. Well, any one of those 52 flight controls on an A380 that move is like you plucking a different string on a guitar. And all those different flight controls on any aircraft will set up these vibrations and movements in the fuselage that may or may not be damped. So with the fly-by-wire aircraft and Airbus, they researched all these many different modes of vibrations, and they've stopped it vibrating. And that's the last reason why the 380 is so smooth, because the flight controls is called dance of the ailerons and the dance of the rudders, and it's written up in the QF32 book. It describes how the computers are predicting a vibration starting the fuselage, and the flight controls will move to stop it. So the 380 is really quite an extraordinary aircraft. Lots of things happening. So this thought of with Airbus aircraft, the pilot doesn't have control, or it doesn't, you know, the Boeing pilots have control, but Airbus pilots just have inputs to computers. It's true to agree, but if you understand just how deep all the logic is in the Airbus system, how many years it's taken to develop, all the multiple computers and all the resilience of the failover systems, you build up this and also the fact that the pilots that tend to crash their buses are doing something silly, like the Havisham flight display in an A320 back in the late 80s. A lot of the flights that crashed with Airbus have been the result of pilots not understanding the fly-by-wire, getting the aircraft to do things it wasn't designed to do, and not understanding how it would perform. But when you understand that, and you understand the logic of all these layers in the onion that are the flight control laws, the aircraft becomes an absolute majestic, extraordinary machine. And it is so, most pilots wouldn't understand, because they haven't necessarily met the people I've met to explain it, just how extraordinary the fly-by-wire systems are in the Airbus aircraft. And the Boeing aircraft are actually catching up very fast. So what I've built to you is because of my different knowledge and the research I did, I've built up the most extraordinary confidence with the 380. And confidence also means that with the computer system, what it gives you is only dependent upon the logic. And so when you have an emergency, if you're on a simple Massey Ferguson tractor and something goes wrong, you can see everything. You can see the bell cranks and how the steering works. And you can easily stop the tractor and understand how it will stop. But when you've got a system controlled by a computer, you don't necessarily have full control over it. You have to understand how the software is working, the sensors coming in, and how it's going to respond. And you have to understand what the computers will give you before you can really work out what you're going to do. And this was certainly the case in QF32. So I had been flying the A380 for about 2 years before the QF32 incident happened. That wasn't a whole lot of time. I probably only had about 1,000 hours on the aircraft. But as I said, I was in the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby looking at the engines and quizzing the engineers 2 weeks before the incident happened. So the QF32 flight occurred on the 4th of November 2010. And we were flying from Singapore to Sydney. It's about an 8-hour flight. There would normally be 3 pilots. But I have to backtrack slightly. Pilots are checked in Qantas about 7 times a year. There are 4 simulator checks that each take about 4 hours, where you're taken to hell and back, and you're pushed beyond your comfort zone. You're doing things that you may not have done before. You're making mistakes, but you're learning. But in pushing the boundaries and learning how to recover from them, sometimes from being, you might not think you're in control if you're doing a very big crosswind landing. But when you learn to work at your limits, it gives you confidence. So the 4 simulators, there's an emergencies check, there's a medical check, and there's a route check. And a route check is where a check captain will sit at the back of the cockpit, and he will just observe you operating the aircraft. Do you obey the rules of the engine limitations? Do you look after the passengers? Do you obey air traffic control? Are you following company procedures? So when everything's going well, the check captain says nothing. At the end of the flight, he'll just say, yes, you pass. But if he has to interfere because something's wrong, then you would, by definition, fail. So this flight, the QF32 flight from Singapore to Sydney, was a route check, and there was Harry on board to be the route check captain. But Harry was actually learning to be a check captain. So we had David Evans, another check captain. So Dave was training Harry. So we had a check captain training a check captain to check me. And there were 5 people in the cockpit. And normally, when you have augmented crews, particularly when there are many captains, too many chiefs and not enough Indians, you can get situations where it's a committee where everyone thinks everyone else is checking something. So you end up with no one checking anything. So there have been a lot of accidents where augmented crews is a big factor in it. But I have to say in QF32, we managed to amalgamate all the brains of the 5 pilots into a shared mental model, and everyone knew we made sure everyone was up to date with what was going wrong. We got all the inputs, and so QF32 was a team success. And this is really important that I should say this, it's a team success. If you listen to Trump, he will blame everyone for the mistakes, and he takes credit for the successes. So a success in aviation is a team success, and a failure belongs to the captain. And if you're not prepared to take that responsibility, then you're not ready for command in an airline. So we have 5 pilots, and we take off, and 4 minutes after takeoff, engine number 2 explodes. And it was a loud explosion. In fact, there were 2 explosions. And it's certainly, when something goes wrong, it initiates the fear response in your amygdala in your brain. It's the old lizard brain, the oldest part of the brain. All animals have it. So the amygdala fires off the fight, flight, or freeze. And we all know this response, and it's natural, and it protects us when things like lions come to attack us. But it's not helpful when you're operating heavy equipment. So when the engines exploded and put us all into the fear response, pilots are trained in their simulators to the fear response is a time that is a great risk to survival. In the case of Air France 447, if you get nervous or tense, your muscles tighten up, your hands would form a fist, and your muscles would pull. And so the fear response would actually have you pulling back, which could explain why the pilots on Air France 447 pulled into a climb when they shouldn't have. But we're trained in Qantas to handle these unexpected things. And if you practice anything that's uncomfortable, if you practice it enough, then you actually get used to it. It won't cause the fear response. So pilots are trained to hear engine failures enough so that we're saying, oh, well, that's just another engine failure, and it doesn't trigger the fear response. And just to reinforce that the fear response doesn't kick in, we have this procedure of aviate, navigate, communicate. This is a very simple rule that is designed to get you through the first 30 seconds of a crisis, when the amygdala is putting in the fear response. And this is before the cortex in the top of your head can take logical control. It takes about 30 seconds for your cortex to catch up with all the senses in your body. So the aviate, navigate, communicate. Aviate, stay alive. If you're being shot at, put your head down. Navigate, just find a safe place. For us, when the engine exploded, I pressed the heading hold that caused the aircraft nose to lower and the aircraft to go into level flight. Now I can do that because I knew that we were above our safety height. I know the safety height. I know that we passed through the safety height so that we would avoid all the hills around us. So I pressed the altitude hold button that would cause the aircraft nose to lower, and I pressed the heading hold button that stopped us following a curve of departure into unknown territory. And so aviate, navigate, and communicate. So I'm navigating the aircraft. I watched the speed. In fact, the auto thrust computers had failed, and so the thrust was stuck too high. I didn't have time to work out why, but I just grabbed the thrust levers and pulled them back to stop the aircraft overspeeding. And I suppose it was about 20 seconds after the engines exploded while I'm doing aviate, navigate, before I got to communicate. And the first word I said, the first word in the whole cockpit, was done about 20 seconds after the explosion when I said ECAM actions. And I said that to Matt. Now, let me just make that clear. The first 20 seconds after this explosion, all the other pilots are monitoring me to make sure that I'm doing the right thing, that I'm not putting the aircraft into a dangerous situation. We're prioritizing staying alive, finding a safe place, and then we can start to communicate. And accidents in aviation happen when people don't do that, where they do an instinctive reaction too fast, and there's a fear response that's initiating it, and that's when things go terribly wrong. So, and I said ECAM actions, and that's assigned to Matt to now action all the different checklists. ECAM stands for Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System. It's a computer that monitors the 250,000 sensors and parameters on an A380. 250,000. So when the system, part of the system says, I've lost this actuator or lost the sensor, the ECAM system will look up a database of problems and solutions and come up with a series of methods to solve it. I'll give you the comparison. The 737 has maybe a system to say that the angle of attack sensors failed, and it will light up a little light, and the light will say angle of attack sensor failed. That's as far as it goes. It won't say what you should do to safeguard your flight, maybe what you should do to try and fix it, or what you should do to mitigate it if you can't fix it. So the 737 cockpit is locked in the 1960s. In fact, the 737 flew before Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and that part of the system hasn't changed. But the A380 ECAM checklist system is dynamic, it's interactive. The nasty checklists come up first, and it gives you solutions to safeguard flight, maybe try and fix it, and if you can't fix it, mitigate it. So it's very impressive. There's about 1,240 50 checklists in an A380, all electronic. And I can show you. On a 737, the quick reference handbook on a 737 would be about 5 inches thick. And this one is only about 6 pages. One is a smoke checklist. Or all engines failed. So if you only need to use a paper checklist if the electronic checklist fails. So the ECAM told us all these different things. We queued up about 40 checklists in the first second after the engine exploded. And I need to explain why. When the engine exploded, what happened was that there was a leak in if you have you have an engine and you have a shaft, many shafts, 3 shafts going through the engine to hold the compressors and the fans, then there will be a bearing support to hold this shaft inside the bearing. And there'll be a pipe going from the side of the engine into this bearing support to feed oil to the bearing. Well, that pipe that feed oil to the bearing had a crack. Oil came out and was in an area of the engine that should be dry of oil. It's still about 700 degrees Celsius, which was that sort of cooling air for that part of the engine. But engine oil will auto-ignite at about 220 centigrade. So when the oil leaked out of that pipe, it ignited and then it had a fire around the shaft, weakened the turbine disc, and the turbine disc then got socked and the turbine disc wrenched itself off the shaft. And the whole disc came loose. And in an unusual behaviour, what then happened was the engine fed more fuel into the engine, and it actually spun up the disc. When the disc was not even connected to the shaft, it actually sped up and then it flew apart and it broke into 3 pieces. And the science would say, the physics suggests that these discs will break into 3 pieces, and that the certification says that aircraft manufacturers must design their aircraft to survive one of these 3 pieces hitting the aircraft. When you design an aircraft to take one of these pieces, Airbus assumed that one piece of the 3, in this situation, it would have infinite energy, so nothing would stop it. Wherever it was going, nothing would stop it. So this is why you offset engines on a wing, so that a turbine failure here, a disc failure, won't take out an engine further down on the wing. So, and then you also locate critical devices in a place that won't be affected by this failure. So the theory says you have 1 piece hit the aircraft. Well, we had 2 pieces hit the aircraft, but those 2 pieces, when they came out of the engine, they empowered or created shrapnel, a bit like a cluster bomb, created hundreds of pieces of shrapnel. So it took out both of the thrust links in the engine that would hold the engine onto the wing to stop the engine pulling itself off the wing. Both those thrust links were broken. It tore off the back of the engine. There are about 100 impacts under the wing, 100 impacts in front of the leading edge of the wing, 200 impacts on the fuselage. So pieces went through the wing, through a fuel tank, or through 2 bits of the wing that were 15 millimeters thick of aluminium, and then through a fuel tank that was 5 feet deep in kerosene, and then came up and then hit the fuselage. So 200 impacts on the fuselage. The impacts up to the top of the 8-story high tail at the back of the aircraft. This is pretty well unprecedented, because the normal statistics is that there's about 14 impacts when a turbine fails. What was unexpected is that this turbine, for some reason, empowered all the sub shrapnel. So we lost all the wires in the leading edge of the wing. We lost about 750 wires. We lost half the networks. Now, remember, I'm talking about the A380 being fly-by-wire, with all these flight control computers, lots of sensors, heaps of sensors, and we've lost half the networks. So half the computers will go offline by at the start. So this is really challenging the survivability of the Airbus designs for systems to take over and to keep the aircraft safe. So out of 22 systems on the aircraft, 21 were affected in different degrees. So with all these failures, we had about 40 checklists, and the ECAM came up in the first second. We certainly couldn't see them. They were all scrolling up. We did about 120 checklists in the hour and a half in the air. Normally in a simulator, you might do 5 ECAMs in 4 hours. We did about 120 in the hour and a half. So there were many times during the flight when I just thought, this is just unbelievable. It felt like, in fact, as each ECAM came up, I felt like I was getting pile driven lower and lower into my seat, because it was just unbelievable that you could just have this succession of failures. And again, we knew that we were actioning the checklist from the worst ones first, and then as we finished those, the easier checklist or the less severe failures would be shown. But the bad ones just kept coming. We didn't know how many more checklists there were in the queue. They just kept coming. And our perception of the airplane comes from ECAM, because we can't see the wings, we can't see the back of the aircraft. So our perception of the damage would come from ECAM, and the ECAM's just giving us bad thing after bad thing after bad thing. At one stage, after about 15 minutes after the explosion, Singapore Air Traffic Control said, just so that you know, pieces of the aircraft have been found on Batam Island in Singapore. And that was actually really good news, because it was actually giving us a perception now that, yeah, parts of the airplane have come off. This is real. The ECAMs aren't false. This really is a serious thing. And so we can probably expect some more ECAMs to come up, because bits of the aircraft are missing. So there was a sense of disbelief. And as you do the ECAMs, it's doing linear threat and error management. In other words, it's trying to, if you have a failure, or it tries to stop you having an error, that wasn't working. So if you have an error, then it says, well, let's try and fix it. But if you can't fix it, mitigate it. So that's threat and error management. And ECAM really is a linear threat and error management system. But as we're doing all these different checklists, and it's highlighting all these different failures that we can't fix, it was about 15 minutes after the explosion that I lost the plot. And I lost the ability to incorporate all these failures, the primary failures, into my mental model. And there were so many primary failures, that was hard to follow, but then there were secondary failures. For instance, we lost 65% of our roll control, which would be okay if we're in balance, but we also had 3 fuel balances, lateral fuel imbalances, 3 different imbalances that were all out of limits. And so the lateral fuel imbalances would question whether we'll have controllability when we come into land, because we've only got 35% of our ailerons left. ECAM doesn't tell us this, but these are the sort of things you have to imagine. We had lost our leading edge slats, and we thought that's okay because we come in fast to keep the lift, but we'd also lost 60% of our brakes. So now we're coming in fast, but we've lost 60% of our brakes. That queries whether we're going to stop on the runway. And ECAM didn't tell us. So at that 15-minute mark, there were so many knock-on effects. I've lost my mental model, and I actually didn't know what to do. And I probably went quiet for half a second, and then I did something instinctively. I got on the radio and I said to air traffic control, I want to climb to 10,000 feet. And they said, yes, approved. And I went to push a thrust up to climb to 10,000 feet, because we were sitting at about 7. And the other pilots yelled out, no, don't do that. And what I was trying to do is, I told air traffic to keep us inside 30 miles at the airport. Don't let us get further out than 30 miles. And the reason is because I'd made some research for Airbus back in 2006 to give them instruction, or to give them guidance on how to do an all-engine out approach with instruments in the cockpit. You see, aircraft are only built to manage certified failures, and no, aircraft aren't designed to you don't have checks where you actually practice ditching in the Hudson River, or you don't have situations where you practice losing all your engines. So there's no guidance. So I gave Airbus a whole lot of guidance on doing a space shuttle approach, which actually Neil Armstrong had designed earlier. But I gave them all that design of what would you do with the flight control computers, the orals systems and display systems to do an engine out approach. And so I knew vaguely where I had to be in altitude and position anywhere. And that's why I requested the climb. And the pilots all yelled out no. So this was a case where I wanted to do something and the whole rest of the crew thought I was nuts. And, as a leader, sometimes you tell your team what to do and you have to do it. This is quite topical, actually. If there's ever a problem in communication with a team, it's the leader's fault. You see, it was my fault in a way. I decided not to climb, but they didn't know why I wanted to climb. They didn't know about this spiral descent that I had already thought of and written to Airbus about. They didn't know that, and I hadn't told them. I was putting them into a regime that they weren't expecting, and they said no. And they thought that I was going to make the situation worse. They questioned me. They said, don't do it. And I thanked them for it, because in their mind, it was a real concern. And you have to have pilots speaking up and saying that they're not happy. You have to have transparency, which is what we probably didn't have with Morrison having all these different portfolios that he'd signed up for. So the leader, if there's a problem with communication, it's the leader's fault. So I didn't continue the climb. If I really thought we were about to die, I would have done it anyway and just to try and explain it later. I didn't have time to explain what I've just tried to explain to you. So I thought, well, maybe they know something else I didn't know. So I didn't do the climb, and I did write about the Armstrong spiral, named after Neil Armstrong, in QF30 in the book. So this is just when I lost the plot. I thought the safest place is to get high in case we lose all our engines, and to glide back. And I also inverted the logic, and we're running out of time, so I can't explain that, but that's written in the book. And the summary is, instead of thinking of when you're overwhelmed in life, there are 4 million bits on an A380 that can fail with those 250,000 sensors. It wouldn't take too many failures to overload anyone. And it wouldn't take too many things to fail in life with all the sensor stuff that's out there today to overload people. So when you're overloaded by all the information and all the failures, then disregard the failures and look at what you've got. Look at what's working. So reversing the logic says stop looking at what's failing and look at what you've got instead. And when you look at survival from a perspective of what you have, particularly in this complex computerized world today, the very complex systems can be reduced down to simple systems, and you can take control of that, which is what we did. So we had to spend about 2 hours getting the aircraft resolved. It took an hour to go through ECAN to try and fix things or to mitigate the failures. And then we made our approach and we landed. After we landed, the check captain thought it was more dangerous on the ground than it was in the air, because now we have more fuel leaking out. We had 4 tons of fuel on the ground. We had an engine we couldn't shut down. If people had, in fact, there was a ATSB review this last week about a passenger evacuation on the Qantas A330 in Sydney about 2 years ago. And it was a trivial problem. They called evacuation, and 10% of the passengers were badly injured. I'd done my research, and I thought that you'd lose about 15%. You would have 15%. 15% of people going down a slide in an evacuation, which is it's controlled in that they will kick you out the door. It's uncontrolled in what will happen as a consequence. You can expect to have 15% of injuries if you evacuate out of an aircraft. Now that's on a 330, but on a 380, the doors are about 2 times higher. You come in at 45-degree slides on the concrete on the hot day. And in our situation, we've got jet fuel underground, but the engine we can't shut down. We've got fire trucks that might run over the people, which is what happened in San Francisco a couple of years earlier. So the risks outside the aircraft for an evacuation are extreme. And I think we would have lost passengers if I decided to evacuate the aircraft, as probably half the pilots criticised me for not doing. If I'd said evacuate, I think we would have lost passengers. They would have died. We didn't evacuate. We kept them on the aircraft, and there were no injuries. So this is 2 hours in the air, 2 hours on the ground. They get the last passengers off after 2 hours, and there's not a single injury. Now, the last part I want to talk about quickly is that was all the technical side. Now we get to the really interesting side of a crisis, and this could equate to anyone, and that is that when you have a fear, we get into fear, it could be a fear of flying, a fear of spiders. There are only about 6 or 7 different vectors for fear. One is feeling that you have no control. You might be constrained and tied down. You don't know what's happening. You don't know what might happen. So you conjure up illusions that you might die. And then there's no one to talk to, and there's certainly no one who's going to tell you what's happening, and there's no one that'll take responsibility. You know, if you have a problem with Qantas and you go to the website, good luck trying to find the telephone number for Qantas. And so in a crisis, these are the vectors for fear that will cause people to panic. And it's the same fear that you might have for a fear of flying, these same vectors. So if you want to stop, if you are in a crisis of your own and you want to stop panic, then identify these vectors for fear and neuter them. So what I did was, and none of this was written in the Qantas books, and in fact, the Qantas hierarchy, I don't think very many people have said, you know, that was good. I think they probably thought I was nuts. They probably thought I was crazy. I told the passengers when they get off the aircraft, don't leave the lounges in the airport. I'll follow them and I'll tell them what happened. So I gave a briefing. Each briefing, there were 3 briefings in 3 different lounges. Each one took 45 minutes, 15 minutes telling them what had happened, why, what was about to happen, and what we needed them to do. 15 minutes of people, the group asking questions. 15 minutes then of individuals asking questions. I told them there'd be media outside, that the media would say that Qantas is a lousy airline, that the Airbus aircraft's bad, fly-by-wire's bad, the Rolls-Royce engines are crap. So I gave them statistics because I'd done it for this. I researched it for the book that engines only fail in 1 in 350,000 engine hours. So only 1 in 4 pilots will ever get to see an engine failure in their whole career. And so, in fact, you as a passenger, having seen this engine failure, would go towards protecting your friends and relatives from seeing an engine failure. So I gave them, I said, I'm telling you what's happened. I haven't even spoken to Qantas because the other crew are talking to Qantas. So you know more about this emergency than anyone else in the world. Bearing in mind that we told the passengers to have their phones off in the aircraft, they've come to the lounge where now the monitors are showing CNN, showing a picture of the A380 saying it's crashed. So people are now calling the people who have had their phones off in the aircraft are now in the lounge, and their loved ones are calling up saying, "You're dead." And I could see the whole atmosphere caving, that the passengers were starting to cry. Not because of what happened on the aircraft, because of what's happening now with their loved ones calling them. And so people are tearing up. So that's why I had to just make sure they had enough facts. But then you get the problem with this vectors for fear. Who's going to take responsibility? Is there a point of contact, a single point of contact? So I told the passengers, Qantas is not going to like this. Get a pencil ready. And I gave them 2 minutes notice. And then I said, look, when you fly Qantas, you're flying a evaluated airline, you paid more to fly with us, and frankly, we've done a rotten job today, and and I'm sorry, but I'll guarantee that we'll get you home safely. So here's my phone number, and call me if you think that you are not getting what you wanted, or if you think that Qantas doesn't care. So I'm putting that metrics in their head, not mine. If their perception is they're not happy, give me a call and I'll fix it. So I gave all the passengers got my mobile phone number. And now Qantas thought I was nuts, total nuts, not written anywhere. What happened was, when you show vulnerability and humility, it breeds trust and teamwork. If people thought I'd been lying, they could now, with my number, they can call me up and abuse me. If they thought they had if they had questions, they would say, look, I won't ask it now, I'll ring him up later and talk to him later. So when people left the terminal after this incident, because I had the phone number, they left, if not with all the information, I knew how they could get it, they left happy. And so there wasn't, in fact, any passengers crying when they left the terminal anywhere in the world when they got home. I'm not aware of anyone crying anywhere. And in fact, the two things, giving full and open disclosure and my personal phone number to take responsibility, none of which were documented, that changed the whole situation. The media was criticising Qantas at that time for having cold in-flight meals. You know, we couldn't take a trip. The media were attacking us at every opportunity. And when they tried to get the passengers to join in with an attack at Qantas, not one passenger joined them. And the media quickly knew they couldn't take a negative approach to QF32. They could only take positive. So we came out of QF32 with a brand in Qantas stronger than when we went in. And that's because of all the phenomenal teamwork. So it's very difficult to explain QF32. I wrote the book about what happened, and then people said, well, why did you give the full and open disclosure on your personal guarantee? Why did you do this? Why did you do it? And so I then wrote a second book, which is called Fly, which is called The Elements of Resilience. And that's the how and whys of resilience. And so then to write a book about personal and corporate resilience is not a small feat. And the first chapter is on neuroscience, because to understand yourself, you have to first understand how you think, act, and communicate. So I've written those two books to explain the highs, the whys, the hows, and the whats. But in summary, QF32 was a team effort where 8 teams, which was the pilots, the cabin crew, air traffic controllers, the policemen, firemen, the Qantas ground handlers, and the passengers. You know, the passengers were part of the team with us. We're 8 teams. We pulled all our elements of resilience, and we overcame what the industry now calls it, which is a black swan event. So I'm really proud of all the teams. QF32 is not my success. It was a team success. I mean, the leader is just like a conductor of an orchestra. It's the musicians that make the music. So I'm indebted to all the teams and all the people in the teams for a remarkable performance. And that's why I'm happy to talk about QF32. And I'm sorry I've taken much longer than 15 minutes. But when people have interviewed me to make a movie, and one group called quits at 5 hours. So I've kept this quite short.
I just thank you very much for your talk tonight. We could read the book, but you've just added bits and pieces there to that we just wouldn't have been able to pick from the book, both from your Air Force time and, of course, from your time with Qantas. And I think one thing I look at there was that it pays to know your aircraft, pays to know the systems, and talk with people as you have with talking with aircraft manufacturers, both brands, Airbus and Boeing, and of course even to talk with the engine manufacturers. trying to get around any potential issues long before they've occurred, and thinking ahead the whole time. Very important, I think. But that aspect of know your aircraft, and I see that even the small aircraft that I fly, that there are some times there where people simply don't know things about the aircraft they're flying. So from that point of view, knowing and talking with Airbus and Boeing and the engine manufacturers, very good value. You've heard enough from me, and all I can say there is, once again, Richard, thank you very, very much for your talk tonight. And question time, of course.
So we'll start with people in the room, and then we'll go to people online.
Okay, guys in the room here, questions. I'll take up the back. Jeff, for a start, just taking a microphone to him. Thank you.
Jeff Hearn.
Jeff Hearn.
I thank you for your effort on the day of the incident in Singapore. I just happened to be in Singapore on that day, and I first saw your aeroplane when I was out of the war cemetery, when you were in holding pattern over the Malacca Straits, being an aircraft spotter. It was a bit unusual. From the war cemetery, we went to the Gun Emplacement Museum, which is right next to the runways, the main runways at the airport at Changi. And I noticed that there was no movement of aircraft whilst I was at the gun emplacement, which was a bit unusual. And towards the end of that little tour, the aeroplanes started to ramp up, and they were, you know, one every 10 or 15 seconds seemed to be taking off. So I thought that was unusual. So we hopped out back into our minibus, and to our lodgings back in Singapore, we went around the boundary of the aerodrome. I then witnessed the fire trucks trying to extinguish the number 4 engine, I think. And I thought, well, that's unusual. So I went back to our lodgings in Singapore. I turned on the TV, and sure enough, what I just witnessed was all over the TV. So I just happened to be there on the day.
Wow.
Now, I have one more question. What happened when you took your return flight the next day to Sydney?
That's a leading question, isn't it?
Thank you.
Because I think it was really interesting you were there, because it would have looked interesting seeing the aircraft coming into land with fuel coming up the back of the wing. That wouldn't be normal, but the next, I mean, I told the passengers that engines only fail one in 350,000 engine hours, so you know that they're not going to see another one. And then the next day, a jumbo was flying us back from Singapore to Sydney to take us back, and Matt and I and the crew were all passengering on that aircraft. And about 4 minutes after takeoff, there was a big bang, and the bang is such that you knew was a compressor, some part of the compressor had failed, and we thought, oh boy, here we go again. And it was a failure of compressor. It wasn't a turbine failure, which is serious. It was a compressor failure, which is, I mean, it still wrecked the engine, but it wasn't an uncontained failure. It was a contained failure. And so I looked across to Matt, who looked at me, and then he just put his eyes shade down over his eyes, put his seat back and went to sleep, because he knew that now you're going through a procedure to dump fuel, come back, it's going to take an hour before you get back on the ground. So you might as well go and have a sleep. And so, yes, there were 2 engine failures in 2 days.
Richard, enjoyed your...
Sorry, just one thing, that is statistics. That's not, you know, I don't come out of that with any horrible feelings. I never had I've never been angry with Rolls-Royce. I did an interview for 4 Corners, and I told Sarah Ferguson, I said, if you ask me any bad questions about Rolls-Royce, I'll either divert them or just go quiet. And if you want unlimited silence, ask me those questions, because I'm only going to support Rolls-Royce. So at the question, when she started the interviews, I had spotlights on me. I'm sitting up with bright lights on me. her first question was, well, what do you think of Rolls-Royce designing faulty engines? So I'd prepared for it, so I had the answer. But no, many people had their guns set on Rolls-Royce, and I never did. I've always been supportive of Rolls-Royce. I mean, people think everyone makes mistakes. Rolls-Royce is a great company. It saved saved the Second World War, and with the Spitfires and the Merlins, and they're a great company, and things go wrong and people make mistakes. That's why you have pilots. That's why you have trained pilots. We just did our job. And so I certainly don't have any bad regrets about Rolls-Royce. And the fact that a jumbo engine failed the next day is just bad luck.
Richard, this is David Anderson here. I have both of your books, which I enjoyed immensely, as I did your talk tonight. So well done, loved it. A couple of questions. The first one is, do you still fly today? When COVID hit, we were just grounded, and I went home, and my wife said, we had written a book about resilience. Now it's time to put it into practice. So I just went, put more effort into the computer business, and I actually joined a company down in Melbourne called Black Magic Design, which, if you don't know it, it's a cinematography company, and it's probably the owner is in the Fin Review every couple of days because he's so revolutionary with his perceptions and perception of the industry and his success. So it's a leading edge, high tech, disruptive company. So with Black Magic, I'm totally in my element again, doing some really high tech computing, construction, engineering work. So I'm not flying. And to some degree, there's a time for everything. And I think I've had 45 years of flying, and I need to transition into not golfing. I'll play golf after I retire, which is the day I die, after I die. But I'm going to go into high-tech disruptive stuff, and Black Magic in Melbourne is the perfect company. So I'm still living the dream. Yeah, no, I guess what I was referring to, not necessarily airline flying, because I know that you're not doing that, but just privately, you still have the enjoyment of flying. Has that left you?
If I was to fly, it'd have to be fast, high tech, and it'd have to be super high tech and fast.
Okay.
So the Pipers and the Cessnas don't thrill me anymore. I'm not criticizing it. It's just that my, all my steps up were in higher tech. And I would need to be in if it was the highest tech machine. I love helicopters, and so I'd happily fly a helicopter, but I'm not searching, or I'm not striving to jump in a Cessna or a Piper.
My last question to you, have you kept a souvenir from the flight, whether it be a broken bit or anything at all from that flight?
That's a really good question. I wanted to get pieces from Qantas to give to everyone in the crew, and we'd frame them, but the engineers never gave me any pieces. So no, I have nothing from that flight. However, Rolls-Royce is giving me a fan blade. And in fact, I did ask them, I said, look, if you find it, do you know what this is? I don't know if it's in focus. It's a high pressure turbine blade off the 380 engine, and it's the most high tech piece on the whole aircraft. So you get about 72 of these on the high pressure disc. Each of these blades costs about $14,000. Generate 800 horsepower of power out of the airflow. The airflow hits the blade. The airflow that hits it to 1600 Celsius. The blade melts at 1200 Celsius. The cooling air comes in the bottom at 700, and the blade sits at 1000 degrees. So, to 1600 degree air, and the blade sits at 1000. Imagine putting an ice cube in the oven at 600 degrees and keeping it frozen. That's what this thing, Rolls-Royce do 16 hours a day for 7 days a week for 365 days a year. That's why I have the most remarkable respect for Rolls-Royce.
Thank you.
And that's a souvenir that I have, which I prize.
Any other questions in the room?
Yeah,
Yep.
Hi, Richard, David here. I wanted to know, with all those ECAM things that came up that you found really hard to deal with, was there any changes to the procedures from Airbus after this whole affair?
Good question. Yes, there were Airbus. I went to Airbus afterwards and sat in a 350 simulator, and they said, you know what, this is what we've done. Remember, I said we had 40 checklists queue up in the first minute, and we did about 120. It took an hour to get to the bottom of the queue, and we never knew how deep the queue was. So Airbus said, we've taken queue of that, and so now we've got ECAM that'll tell you which checklist you're in and an overview of the other checks to go. So that was one. They said they couldn't put in my engine out approach into the flight management computers that I'd sent them in 2006 because, and this is the problem with the whole bloody aviation industry. They said, we like the logic. If we put it into the flight management computers to guide the pilots when they've lost all the engines, we'd have to train it. And if you've got to train it, that costs money. And airlines are trying to airlines are paying their CEO, you know, all the money the airlines are saving by not having enough training, they're paying their bloody CEOs and their executives, you know, super bonuses. So they're putting pressure on the every part of the operation and limiting the scope. A major part of the reason for Boeing's 737 problem is because Southwest Airlines said we want to have commonality across all the aircraft. And so if we have to do a differences course for the 737 because you make a new system or bring in an ECAS system or aero system, then Boeing would have to pay Southwest $1 million per aircraft. And so there was Southwest telling Boeing not to change their aircraft or develop it. And so there have been a lot of changes. Not all the changes get in that you want, and that's just the perpetual challenge that people in the industry have. It's such a high-risk environment with such amazing professionals in it that it's sometimes disappointing to see the way some of them are treated.
Thanks, Richard. It seems like we don't have any more questions in the room, so we're going to go to the online folks. I can see Bob Livingston has his hand up, and you'll have to unmute yourself, Bob. Just go ahead.
Yeah, just a simple, relatively simple question, and it relates to the preamble rather than the story of the QF32. Building aeroplanes out of carbon fibre to reduce the total weight is not just to reduce the weight. An aeroplane gets to a maximum weight can only fly in our atmosphere. So the idea is that you're not only reducing weight, but you're being able to produce an aeroplane which can carry more and still fly in the atmosphere. Am I right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And the other thing with, particularly with the 350 wing, the Airbus 350 wing, is with composite or carbon fibre, these epoxy type structures, you can put strength wherever you want. You can just put a few extra layers of fiberglass or carbon fibre in a high stress area and then take away from others. It's so much easier to design a structure with variable stress with carbon fibre than it is with aluminium, where you've got to machine a big piece of steel. It's very, very hard. So there are many savings that come in. Well, there's no fatigue, there's no corrosion, there is, it's lighter for the strength, but also it enables you to build structures easier. Curiously, because it's such a strong material, it tends to ring. So the 787 fuselage tends to vibrate, a high frequency vibration or rings, because it's so stiff. That's the only downside. I don't think I can't think of really that's a trivial problem. Maybe there's a lightning damage, which is a bit controversial after that lightning strike that 787 had a few months ago. Apart from that, I think the composite stuff is just remarkable. It's fantastic. And they're using 3D printing to make the 777, the new 777 wing.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions.
Thanks, Richard.
Richard Honest has a question. I see Dennis Smith has a question, but Richard, if you unmute yourself, go ahead.
Richard, in QF32, I found one of the most interesting parts was your father's life in World War II at Geelong Grammar Boarding House. Can you tell me when he used to get up surreptitiously in the night and ride away to an RAAF airfield, about how far was it to go to that airfield? Did he ride his bike, and where actually is that airfield?
The airfields don't exist anymore. There were two different things he did. He'd jump out of his dormitory, get on a bike, and fly to an airfield where they were doing nighttime training, and he would go to the holding point, bash on the side of the aircraft. They'd let him in. He'd sit on the wings. He'd sit on the wing spar in between the two seats. There was no seat for him. He sat on the wing spar. I mean, this is during the war too, when they probably think they need as many people as they can. And so the rules, things were quite different then. So he used to go flying and come back and slip back into his room. Later on, after that, he used to sneak away during the daytime and go to at Corio, where there was a distillery. It was a distillery plant. Now, Dave, you know about this, Dave Fredericks, because Dave helped me find out the name of the commanding officer at this place. It was an assembly plant where they were assembling Mustangs from America and then flying them to Avalon. So Dad would get on a bike, go to this distillery aerodrome. There was just a temporary structure with the Americans there, and he would take part in delivery flights of these aircraft to Laverton and places. And the officer there put Dad in the left-hand seat and was giving him flying instructions. And so Dad had to sneak down low. When they got to Laverton, where there's all these military police guarding the base, he'd have to, hide down low so they didn't know he was there. So that was an extraordinary time. And the funny after event that was, Dad went up to his father. Dad was 16 years of age, and Dad went up to his father about five years later and said, "Dad, I have to tell you something. When I was at Geelong Grammar, I used to sneak away and go flying, and no one ever caught me. I was never caught." To which my father's father, my grandfather, said, "Well, have a look at this." He pulled out a letter, and it was written by, I think at the headmaster's name. He said, "Dear Mr. de Crespigny, we are aware that your son is going truant at least once a day to go to the Air Force base and go flying an aircraft. And we think it's great that he has a passion and that we should probably endorse rather than inhibit. So depending on what, we'll take whatever action you deem necessary, but we're happy for it to proceed." And so, and my grandfather said, "Yeah, let him keep doing it." So the school knew about it, and it's a great story. It's a wonderful story.
Terrific. Dennis Smith, please go ahead. You'll need to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Richard, for that. My company was heavily involved with Quantam, the Worldwide Computer Centre, for quite a long period. And I witnessed the demise of Qantas when they privatised it and went downhill. And I saw members like yourself that had been there 20, 25 years, worked their way up and were actually really excellent at what they were doing. And now underneath what used to be the Qantas International Centre, of course, is a fitness first gym. Yeah. So I traveled around with them a few times, went to with other corporations, and I regarded Quantam as probably sitting in the top 5% of computer centers in the world. The disaster recovery and the running, we had, I think there was at least 5 external outages in Quantam, and the rest of the world didn't know, because they'd back up their generators in the basement that could run for a couple of weeks at a time. And they were constantly talking about disaster recovery, and going up on the level 5 in the cafeteria, sitting around, that the corporate responsibility for people that were so proud of working for Qantas, and I think people like yourself have obviously proof that they had the right environment, and then unfortunately it seemed to have gone downhill. And the troubles they're running into now is, as an Australian airline, it's just shameful.
I think that where it is at the moment, it's a real disappointment. Part of resilience is identifying your critical assets and protecting them. And whether it's national resilience with oil or electricity or defence, or it's an airline with people to manage the engineering and the ground handling. And every critical asset must be protected. And I think we've lost the plot a bit. And so I feel a bit sad too. Curiously, interestingly, the Qantas had all these big mainframes with a whole lot of COBOL programs, and maybe they forgot how to change or didn't know how to change the programs. So when I joined, they said my name, the Champion de Crespigny, was too big. So I had to simplify it to de Crespigny. And just think about it, there's only 30,000 employees, and they had to add 2 characters. So in their computer system, they needed to add 60,000 characters to store longer names or my name in the computer. And it took them until 2018 to do that. In other words, my full name could not be put in the Qantas computer until 2018. Yeah, so some things happen slowly.
Another question in the room.
Yep. Richard David Knight again. Your book finished on a very down note. Actually, the last sentence referred to you being checked out, coming back from Singapore, and the question was, did you pass? And you said no. How could that be? I felt very disappointed at that answer.
Well, I was too. A week after the flight, the ATSB, Transport Safety Bureau, called Qantas chief pilot Peter Wilson and said, "We've got no issues now with your crew. You can do whatever you want," which is really quite extraordinary. Sometimes when there are incidents, the ATSB can say, it'll take us a year to work out whether we have an issue with what the pilots did. So Peter Wilson rang me up and said, "Look, the ATSB have said you're all clear, and so you're cleared back online to go flying." He said, "But I had to ask, how did your route check go?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Dave never told me." So I rang Dave straight away. This is a Tuesday after the Thursday incident, and said, "Dave, can you finish the paperwork?" And he said, "Well, I can't." I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Well, there wasn't a route check." I said, "Well, yes, there was." And he said, "No, when the engine exploded, we joined in to help the crew." That's Dave and Harry. We joined in. So when we join in, the route check is stopped. So there was no route check. I said, "Come on, Dave, in an emergency, we have relief from all kinds of rules and regulations. Everything we do is to guarantee safety, and the rules and regulations are irrelevant if they're going to, and to be avoided if they're going to damage that task. So you can do anything in the pursuit of safety." And I said, "I think we did a good job, and it was an unusual flight. I think everyone worked well, and I think I deserve to pass the test." And he said no. And so I don't agree with his decision. I think it might be, if you follow the rules, he's correct. I certainly respect his opinion, and it's his right to make it, but I don't agree with it. And curiously and humorously, neither did Qantas, because I kept flying, and the Qantas training department passed me in their system, and I flew for a year. And it wasn't until a year after I had been flying back on the line again that Qantas suddenly realised, oh, there was never a route check put in, there was never a check forms put into that flight. And so technically you haven't passed the route check, but we just ticked you off anyway.
Very good.
Oh, that's a great outcome. Any other questions from people online? And I'm watching, hopefully I can see people putting their hands up.
One more.
Oh, another one from the room, sorry.
Richard, I'm wondering if you're able to tell us something about the book that you're currently writing.
Oh, no, I'm writing a book. Well, there's two books I've really got to do. I'm trying to finish off automating the house. I'm actually automating the house the way Airbus automate their computers, automate their flights. So it's a big process, but so that's keeping me busy. But I'm writing two books. I want to finish off the Big Jets book, which is about how big jets are designed and constructed and tested. Because if you can understand how an aircraft is designed and built, then it'll help you understand how to fly. So it's to replace handling the big jets. So that book, that was 30% complete when the QF32 happened. So I just have to commit to finishing and finish it. And that's not a big stress. The second book I'm writing is on fear of flying. About 20% of people have a fear of flying. 8% of the people don't fly because they have such a strong fear of it. And I alluded to it in my discussion before, but the vectors for the fear of flying is just the same as the vectors for any fear and the fear of the passengers during QF32. So when I was flying in Qantas, every sector, when we're in the cruise and there were pilots in the cockpit to relieve me, I would go in the cabin and I would tour the cabin. And it's very possible that I've met someone in this group touring around the cabin on a 380. So I would tour both decks. It would take up to 2 hours to walk around the aircraft, because if people wanted to stop and chat, I would chat to them about anything they wanted. And if they had an interest in the aircraft, I'd say, well, come with me, and I'd take them for a walk around the aircraft and show them the aircraft and explain anything. And in particular, if there was someone that had a fear of flying, I would say, look, I've been able to fix everyone that I've attempted to fix. So if you want me to look at the fear of flying and see if we can fix it, let's come with me. So I take them on a walk around the aircraft. And to fix the fear of flying, you need to do it in the environment in which they're in that causes them fear. You need to have them primed with all these inputs so they can acknowledge and understand the fear inputs coming in, and then we can work and build them the skills to beat it. So I'd take them on the walk around the aircraft, and it'd take about 2 hours to introduce them to the neuroscience of fear and how their body behaves and how they can take control of their emotions and how they can either stop pumping the senses that creates fear or actually create movement and behavior patterns to stop it. And it was always successful. So many times, I guess about 1 in every 3 walks around the cabin, I'd have someone that I'd be trying to cure their fear of flying. In fact, the cabin crew all knew me for this, and they would come up to me during a flight to say, look, we've got the person in seat 25, Juliet, who has a fear of flying. So I'd go and get them at the start of the flight and walk them around the cabin and work on them. So I think I have resolved the fear to its core elements. And so the next book was about that.
So Dave, I'll hand back over to you and you can finish this up for the evening.
Thanks, Derek. And Richard, just once again, many thanks for a entertaining, enlightening speech talk tonight. We could read the book, but you've just added bits and pieces that make it so educational. And I and all the people both here with me and also Zoom as well I'm sure have appreciated that. So from me and all the crew, once again, thank you very much for your speech tonight, your talk, and we certainly did appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you again sometime. You're at the DC2 event here in Melbourne some time back, and I look forward to catching up with you in person sometime in the future there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Noel, for having me invited. And I just wish everyone in the group all success and happy flying. And we're all sort of very close-knit in aviation. We all think and behave similar ways. And so it's been a delight to talk to you. Thank you for your questions. And I hope I see you sometime in the future. Thank you.